I'm Erwin, born in 1931, July 29th. Oldest of the four boys of Nebert and Jesse Forde. As we grew up there on Vincennes, I got to the point where I really didn't like the city because there was too much fighting was going on, and my father said, we're going to have to get these boys out of the city because Erwin is going to hurt somebody seriously, which he was trying to do. And so we eventually moved to Michigan, 80 acres in Bloomingdale, and personally, I thought I had died and gone to heaven because I loved Michigan so much. Nobody fighting, and the kids that we knew were nice kids. Our mother, Jessie, she was an excellent cook. She did a lot of baking, and when we moved to Michigan, a lot of people thought that my folks had separated, but they had not separated. They were trying to give us a better life because Dad did not stay up there because he had that business going on in Chicago. But he would only come up to the farm once every 2 weeks to make sure Mother had the money and this and any other things she needed. And she would send him back to Chicago loaded up with all kinds of food, baked goods and this and that, to make sure he wouldn't be hungry until he came back in a couple of weeks. And living in Michigan was good for us, especially for me, because I was able to get away from evil that was there in Chicago, and I didn't get into the problem of hurting somebody seriously that my father thought I was going to be wind up doing.
Your mother made the baked beans and the grape juice.
Yeah, my mother would always make the baked beans, and she would make her own grape juice. I remember she had a strainer, and she would strain the juice through this cloth, and she would make bottles and bottles of grape juice. Half of it she'd send back to Chicago with Dad. And but it was very good juice that we didn't get enough of as boys, especially Winton and I. And but living in Michigan was good for the four of us. Of course, Nathan and Hank were too young, really, to remember, I think, a lot of it. Matter of fact, I didn't know Hank that well because when I was leaving for Europe, Hank was only a year and a half old. And when I came back 3 years later, he was almost 4 years old, and I got married and I was gone. So I really didn't know Hank that well. But Nathan, I knew him a little bit better. He was, I was 12 years older than Nathan. I was 19 years older than Hank. Winton, he was my sidekick because he was only 5 years younger than I was. So we had a wagon, and a lot of times I would pull him in the wagon. And one time he was sitting in the wagon, and all of a sudden I jerked the wagon because we wanted to get going wherever we were going, and he went backwards. Fell out of the wagon, hit his head there on the pavement, and blood came rushing out of the back of his head. And Mother happened to be looking out of the window. She came rushing out of the house, and I guess a layer of skin was hanging off your father's head. And she grabbed it and stopped the bleeding and went down to Providence Hospital to get first aid from him, for him. And But Winton was, he was always, since we were close in age, he was always the brother that I was, closer to. He was always little brother. And the other boys were just too young for me to fool with. I shouldn't say that, but they were just too young for me to really be partners with. But Winton was closer in age. It was only 5 years, so. And I think something that I found out that I didn't know, he was my sidekick, and I was his hero. And that was about our connection that we had with each other, because we were closer in age. And growing up, Dad said, "You fellows now, you're growing up to be men, so now act like it." And Mother in the background would say, "And no mama boys either." My father was, he was a church man. He was, he really liked working with the young people. And when he was working at the Del Prado Hotel as a waiter, matter of fact, he was making big tips. That's why he was able to buy a building to start off with. Sometimes one time that I remember, my mother called up the hotel looking for him. She wanted to talk to him about something. And she said, "I want to talk to Nebert Forde." They didn't know who Nebert Forde was. They said, "Nebert Forde? We don't have a Nebert Forde here." He says, "Oh yeah, he's one of the waiters." And finally, one of his co-workers said, "Wait a minute, I know who Nebert Forde is. He's Preacher. They call him Preacher." And so they told my mother, "You want to talk to Preacher." That's what they knew my father was as Preacher, because he was always sharing the gospel with people that he worked with. And my father really wasn't that great of a disciplinarian. Well, he was, but he was not. Mother was always the one that was correcting us. Dad was always the one that was out making a living for us. And I remember one time when there in Michigan, I asked my mother, I said, "Why can't Dad be up here with us?" She said, "That's where the money is coming from, by him being there in Chicago taking care of buildings." He had 5 buildings by that time. And so Mother said, "That's where the money is coming from," because Mother never needed money, because Dad always made sure that she had enough money to take care of us while we were there in Michigan. It wasn't the fact that he dropped us off and then went off and left us. No, he didn't do that. He always had us on his mind. He's always, he kept his promise. He'd always come up every other weekend to make sure everything was okay. During the time that I lived in Michigan, there was a law that all boys by 17 had to register with the government. I was only 2 hours away from college, and I knew I was going to be drafted out of college, which I was. I hoped that I would be sent to Europe, and after basic training, I was asked where did I want to go. And so they gave me 3 choices out of 7 areas in the world. All 3 of my choices were Europe, and they sent me to Europe. And I never had any trouble with the Sabbath, because there was a law that said all Adventist boys had Sabbath off. And so going to Europe on this ship, now I'm in the Army, but this ship was United States Navy. And this naval officer came to me and said, I have your name, stand watch, Friday night to Saturday morning. I never mentioned the Pentagon, but I said, Lord, are you behind this? And so I said, well, to the naval officer, I said, sir, I'm not supposed to be on duty. This is the Sabbath to me. He says, you're a what? I said, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. And that's when I really had to stand for my truth. And so I said, I'm not supposed to be on duty during that time, Friday night to Saturday morning. I said, but any other time, sir, night or day, I'm at your service. He said, I'll get back with you. When he came back about 3 hours later, he said, I found out you have connections with the Pentagon. You don't have to be on duty during the Sabbath. He said, well, you willing to work Saturday night to Sunday morning? I said, yes, sir. So he had me on duty from Saturday night to Sunday morning that first weekend. The second weekend, we were still at sea. It was a 13-day run across the Atlantic Ocean. And so he came and got me again, had me on duty from Saturday night to Sunday morning. We got to England. He said, by the way, would you like to transfer to the Navy? He said, we need men who can stand for the right. I said, well, thank you, sir, but I don't think I would make a good sailor. But anyway, while I was in Europe, everything went fine. No problem. I was put behind a desk to order parts for the mechanics that were taking care of a vehicle that belonged to this big medical hospital where I was attached to. And so for a year while I was sitting behind a desk, they came to me and asked me if I would be willing to be transferred to the mechanic department and be re-educated. I said, well, sir, yes. I said, but will that put me on the convoy list? He says, you want to be on the convoy list? I said, yes, sir. He says, we need mechanics on the convoy list. He says, we'll get you on the convoy list. And so anytime there was a convoy, I would be on that list, as a mechanic, riding through the towns of Germany. And to me, I was just having a good time. So actually, my time in the military, I thought was nothing but a paid vacation. I was promoted to corporal while I was in the military. And I was asked if I would be interested in going 15 years and retiring. But, you know, being young, I said, no, I don't think so. But to this day, I am sorry that I didn't go ahead and accept that offer. And when I came back, I decided I wanted to live in California. And my mother said, you don't want to live in California. She said, you have visited California. She said, it's a nice place to visit, vacation. She says, but knowing you, you're not going to like California. Well, Beta and I got married and headed for California. Mother was right. I didn't want to live in California. And came back, and it took a while for us to move away from Chicago. In the meantime, I got a call from Hinsdale Hospital. They had a position that they were interested in me fulfilling. Well, I went to take an interview at Hinsdale Hospital, and I decided that I would go ahead and put California on a waiting list, and we wound up moving to Hinsdale. And I was there in Hinsdale for 25 years, working in the purchasing department. And during that time that I was there, Betty passed away. That was one of the worst times of my life, losing her. God had a plan for me and brought Roslyn into my life. Roslyn's parents and my parents were close friends, and when we were born, the parents decided they wanted to marry us off once we were grown, but as we grew up, we never dated each other, and Roslyn winds up marrying a guy who was a friend of mine, and at the same time, I got engaged to a girl who was a friend of Roslyn's. But then, of course, we had moved to Michigan, and I got drafted from the state of Michigan, and when Roslyn got married, my mother was really upset with me because she said, you never paid any attention to her, now she's married to somebody else, and she was ready to hang me, But I really think that was God working, because I feel like God was saying, okay, I'll honor the prayers of the parents, but when I decide, And so anyway, after 42 years of marriage, Roslyn became a widow. 3 years later, after I had 42 years with Betty, I lost Betty. A year later, one thing, when Betty passed away, I asked Roslyn to help me with the obituary, and which she did. I gave her pointers, and she wrote it out. And after she finished it, I said, well, you wrote it. How about you reading it at the memorial service, which she did, which took a load off of me. And as far as the family response, I had Dan do that. It took another load off of me. And both of them, Roslyn and Dan, did an excellent job in doing what I asked them to do. And as time went on, Roslyn and I grew together more and more, and that's how we wound up getting married, like our parents had wanted us to do in the first place. But by that time, both the parents had passed on. But like I said, God says, when I decide.